Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Stefan from Business Review, and I will be your host. It is our pleasure to have Novotec with us today, who will be presenting this webinar titled Achieving Regulatory Milestones and Meeting Commercial Goals. Today's guest speakers are Tracy Brown, Principal Consultant at Novotec, Dr. Hiram Chipperfield, Principal Consultant at Novotec, and Robert Shepard, PhD, Research and Development Director at Dimerix Bioscience. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar platform On24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link you received via email to rejoin the session. In order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen and click Submit. We'll allocate some time at the end of today's session to address any questions or thoughts that you may have. Please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. But now, please allow me to welcome Hiram.
Thank you, Stefan, for that introduction. My name is Hiram Chipperfield, and as mentioned, I'm a principal consultant with the BioDesk team at Novotec. We'll pass along to Tracy in the next section, and to finish up, we'll be talking with Dr. Robert Shepard from Dimerix. So to start off with, I'll start with an overview of today's webinar. We'll start off with the introduction of Novotec, and then we'll introduce today's topic, which is regulatory milestones and commercial goals. We're going to break that up today into two major parts. The first part is what do you need to get into a clinical trial, and the next part is a roadmap to registration. We'll follow that up with an example of one of our sponsor companies, Dimerix, and then at the end of the session, we'll have time for some questions. So Novotec is an Asia-Pacific specialist clinical research organisation. We were established in 1996 and have got on-the-ground operations in Australia, New Zealand, and a range of Asia-Pacific countries. I won't go through, there's a lot of information on this slide, and I won't go through it all. But suffice to say, we use best-in-class technology, and we've managed over 1,200 projects, including the APAC component for pivotal trials leading to multiple FDA, EMA, and other registered products. As mentioned, we have a large base in Australia and also New Zealand, and then over, in total, 1,500 people across 21 offices in 12 geographies. So you can see from this slide we have an extensive on-the-ground presence across the Asia-Pacific region. So Novotec is a clinical research organisation. Part of the services that Novotec offers is BioDesk, and we are at the in-house regulatory affairs and product development service that's provided by Novotec. Basically, what we do is we work closely with clients to design and implement their therapeutic product development programs. We try and guide companies through drug development process to achieve their company milestones, including regulatory milestones. And the team consists of over 10 experts with extensive experience in aspects such as CMC, toxicology, clinical and medical affairs, and also regulatory affairs. And so this is just a little diagram of how this BioDesk fits in with the greater clinical research organisation services. So we have clinical medical consulting, regulatory affairs consulting, manufacturing, toxicology, medical writing. That fits in with the phase 1 clinical trial, the phase 2, phase 3, other clinical trials, and we can manage aspects from ethics submissions through to global regulatory submissions all the way through to marketing authorization applications. So that was a little bit about the Novotec and the BioDesk team within Novotec. Now I'd like to move on to the topic of today's webinar, which is regulatory milestones and commercial goals. So regulatory milestones and commercial goals can very much vary by the stage of development of the company and the commercial goals of the company. They can start off in the early stages of drug development, including target discovery, lead compound or discovery or lead compound optimization, the early proof of concept primary pharmacology animal studies. For a company in that stage of development, a typical regulatory milestone, which we'll talk about later, or a typical even commercial goal to get to the next stage of funding might be the initiation of a first-in-human clinical trial. Later on in development, we have the IND enabling package, or the critical non-clinical safety studies that need to be conducted prior to an initial clinical trial. And then an IND or a clinical trial regulatory approval is another milestone that's widely used by companies to promote their compound and also unlock commercial funding. The next stage, we move into clinical development. Depending on the therapeutic product or the indication, this can vary, but typically you might have a phase 1 where the first human is dosed, phase 1 or phase 2 where you have your first patient dosed. Phase 2 is where you would typically expect an efficacy indication or some kind of proof of concept efficacy indication. And then you move on to your pivotal phase 3 program where you need to establish safety and efficacy of your product. During this phase, there's also other milestones or goals that are important for some companies, and these include expedited development programs such as orphan drug designation or fast track approval for the program. Even further on, once you've completed your clinical development, then you have your registration or marketing authorization in your primary markets. These goals here can be the submission of for example, the NDA or the BLA application or the marketing authorization application, product approval, product launch, or reimbursement. And then you move on to similar goals in potentially secondary markets or second-tier markets. So there's a lot of goals there, and we don't have time to go through all of them on today's webinar. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on two key areas or two key goals that a lot of companies that we work with have. The first one is the preclinical goals, so developing your preclinical package and getting that first regulatory approval for a first-in-human clinical trial. The second goals or milestones that we'd like to talk about in today's webinar is the clinical development for your therapeutic product. This is a slightly longer series because it has different stages, but we're looking at very much the clinical development pathway leading up to the submission of the initial marketing authorization or registration application. So now I'll pass it over to Tracy to talk about the first clinical trial. What do you need for your first clinical trial?
Well, thanks, Hiram. I'm going to discuss, as Hiram just mentioned, some details around the non-clinical safety studies or the IND enabling package that could be required for the first-in-human clinical trials. So to discuss a little bit further detail about the first clinical trial and what's required to support that, this slide takes us through a few different options that can be considered depending on the type of material that's actually being developed and considered for that first clinical trial. So on the left-hand side, you can see that this is maybe a typical spectrum of studies that might be required to support a variety of NCE-type compounds. It should be noted that the package, this is a bit of a prescriptive list, but that the actual content of this package should be very much tailored to the actual compound and the aim of the clinical trial. So you can see it follows a CTD type of structure, and it might start with a package of pharmacology studies, typically looking at the efficacy of the compound and understanding maybe a little bit about the mechanism of action to give some reassurance that the NCE being developed is going to have a chance of being successful in the indication. This also covers some safety pharmacology assessments and maybe the adverse part of the compound if there was to be any unwanted effects on the cardiovascular system, respiratory or central nervous system. The package of studies will also cover some basic pharmacokinetics at this early phase, including some understanding of absorption of the material, assuming it's not a direct intravenous route injection, some idea of early metabolism through in vitro studies, as well as some basic pharmacokinetics such as Cmax and AUC information. Further on, and maybe the pivotal part of the study is, or the package should I say, is the repeat dose toxicology studies, often performed in 2 species for an NCE. The duration of these can vary and should be decided based on the initial clinical trial that wants to be supported, or at least looking just slightly into that program, because often as you go through the program, the increment of duration of these studies will be progressed as the program progresses. Another key part of this package is the genetic toxicology, and that initially starts with an in vitro set of studies. May include an in vivo study at this stage, but that could be deferred slightly as long as the in vitro studies are negative. Another aspect that's quite important and often included within the repeat dose study designs are some examination of the local tolerance effects, particularly if that was an injectable route of administration or maybe even being given directly to the respiratory tract. We often get asked if there's any differences with packages that might be submitted to Australia versus those that might go into, say, the FDA or Europe. And I'd say it's fairly typical that most of the jurisdictions have very similar expectations through these, for these types of products, and there's very few differences at this stage. Other types of products that's perhaps captured on the right-hand side of the slide are really relating to biological type materials. And the package of work that are used to support these do vary very much according to the nature of the product, and don't necessarily follow the standard CTD format as you see with an NCE. So their program's very much tailored according to the risks associated with that type of product. So if you might, for example, for a cell therapy or gene therapy, you're considering where it's deposited, how that material is then translated into a gene or a protein, and how that biodistribution pattern looks like in terms of the desired site of the effect versus maybe tissues and organs where it is not desirable to have that material. Live biotherapeutic products, similarly, are quite different and a unique challenge all on their own, because you're actually giving a live bacterial product at this point, and most of its, I suppose it actually retains usually in the gastrointestinal tract and has a direct effect maybe on the microbiota or maybe even on a distant site. So they have their own unique challenges and is not as simple as they may seem. Another type of product that we often get asked about, and we're going to talk a little bit more about in some case studies later on, are repurposed drugs, whether that's a change in indication, a route of administration, or maybe a reformulation. And they have their own unique challenges in understanding the product that was on the market previously compared to how it was want to be used going forward and where those gaps may actually lie. So moving on, I'd like to talk a little bit about a gap analysis type of approach that we often consider when looking at new packages of information. As I've described on the previous slide, we're looking at a group of studies usually that have been put together to support the first-in-human package, and that's not just one piece of work. That may be a series of studies performed by the client themselves, the sponsor, or actually through a combination of data and literature. So what we're actually looking for here is to understand, does the package support the intended clinical trial design? So we'd be very keen to look at maybe the investigator's brochure as well as any in-depth reports and the protocol in question, so that we can understand whether the package as a whole supports the safety of that material moving forward. So we're looking to identify if there are any particular showstoppers that would prevent progression successfully. That may be in terms of a toxicity endpoint, or it might actually be that something appears to be missing and hasn't been evaluated. So we'd make a series of recommendations possibly as to what types of studies would actually be needed to fill that information gap. Or if there was a toxicity, have we found a no adverse effect level for that? And does that allow appropriate progression into the clinic with a suitable safety margin before any volunteer or patient might be dosed? In terms of output for that type of material, it can often be written as quite a detailed document, making a comprehensive list of recommendations and comments, or could be a top-level list of key aspects to the development program through a series of bullet points within an email. And it's something that you can see BioDesk has performed a number of these types of analyses quite formally or informally as we write investigators' brochures. It's something that we do automatically all the time and have quite experience in the last 6 or so years that we've been in development. So moving on to the first case study example of a gap analysis that we undertook some time ago. This involved a repurposed material. It was originally an active within a shampoo, and it had been on the market for very many years. And so it had been developed probably back in about the 1970s. It was now going to be repurposed, so the active ingredient was going to be reformulated in an ophthalmic formulation and was going to be placed on the eyelid as an ointment treatment for marginal blepharitis. The initial clinical trial was going to be a phase 1 study in volunteers, quickly moving into patients, and was going to be conducted in Australia. So the historical information, because it was pretty much based on literature at this stage, and there was client had no studies of their own performed. So we had a detailed literature review and a look on the FDA website to see if they actually had described any of the preclinical package within the publicly available documents. And it was to our surprise that they actually had, considering the age of the original submission. And they'd actually provided an extensive amount of information, including 13-week toxicity studies by the dermal and the oral route, and a series of irritancy information terms, including ocular irritancy. So that was pretty good. So we summarised that information in quite some detail, understanding where the effects of toxicity, because it was actually a little bit irritant, and where that lied and where the clinical formulation wanted to be. And we did notice that the formulation that had been used in the past did show some irritancy to the eye in the concentration range that the client wanted to use the material moving forward, although the formulation was about to change. So we did recommend that the client perform a new ocular irritancy study with the clinical formulation in question, just to check whether that was still acceptable to move forward with. And interestingly, on this package, we didn't find any evidence of genotoxicity studies having been performed, which was quite surprising considering its extensive clinical use over many years. But to bring the package up to today's standards, we did recommend that the client perform some in vitro genetic tox, just to be sure that the material was having no concerns in that area. The studies, as far as I'm aware, were actioned, and the phase 1 study, was successfully approved and actually started. And I believe this client has now moved into phase 2. So moving on to my second example. This is related to dimerics compound and package of information, which we'll talk to Robert a bit later in the presentation. But this is to give you some background. It was originally a repurposed drug used in Japan for hepatitis, and was going to be used for a new indication for the treatment of various kidney disorders. The aim was to have a look across the package to see what information was available and where the gaps might lie to support eventual phase 3 and market application. So the initial approach was to have a look at the literature information, which was extensively going to be used in this instance, to understand what studies might be required for the initial phase 2 studies to begin with. And it was also important for this material to understand the pharmacological interaction of the DMX-200, as it was going to be used on a background of standard of care in these patients. And interestingly for this material, there was a pharmacological interaction between DMX-200 and the class of angiotensin II antagonists that it would be co-administered with. So it was quite interesting in our experience. It's not often that you see something where you get a combination interaction. So from that point of view, was an interesting project. In terms of the gaps identified, we identified a series of studies that might be required as the program progresses, and there was an interaction with the FDA regarding that information and whether the literature was going to be acceptable to support that IND submission, and we're pleased to say that that was a successful meeting. So now we'd like to move on to some discussion on the roadmap to registration, and I'd like to hand over Hiram to take that one forward.
Thanks, Tracy. So you've heard from Tracy how we can get into our initial clinical trial and kind of the type of analysis that is used to support the planning for that initial clinical trial. What I'd like to talk about now is beyond that initial clinical trial, through the clinical development, through to marketing authorization. So there are many ways or many kinds of documents or plans that can be developed in order to develop a strategy to move your product to its next regulatory goal or to its next commercial goal. But what I'd like to talk to today is about what we call a drug development plan. And basically, this is, as it sounds, it's a plan on how to develop your drug. And it describes the steps that are required to generate the evidence to support marketing authorization and reimbursement these days. And it includes CMC quality requirements, non-clinical requirements, the non-clinical animal studies that you need to conduct, and the type and scope of clinical studies that are going to be needed to support the registration of your product. In addition to what might be the typical phase 1, 2, or 3 program, a strength of a drug development plan is it highlights additional requirements or additional studies that might be needed to support the application, such as clinical studies in special populations or drug-drug interaction studies. You can have a drug development plan which covers all these aspects, or you can have a more focused, what we call a clinical development plan, which is basically the same thing, except that it focuses only on the clinical development and puts aside the quality, manufacturing, and non-clinical requirements. Just to provide an indication of our experience, we've prepared over 30 drug development plans. So there are many ways of structuring a DDP. The one that we prefer generally use it goes something like this. We start off with a scientific rationale for the development of the product, and this includes a brief summary of the target indication and why the product is being developed. This really sets the scene for the product and provides a place in the treatment cascade, if applicable, for the product. We'd then look at predicate or similar competitive products that are on the market or are currently in development. This forms not only an important part of commercial analysis, but also provides really useful information on the kinds of studies, kinds of information that will be needed to support the marketing authorization of the product. Then that leads directly into the regulatory and marketing authorization strategy. In some cases, you'll be targeting your product for a global registration study, so that major markets, including the US, EU, China. In other cases, you might have a more focused approach. So we've been seeing a number of companies recently which have a more Asia-Pacific focus. That might be for commercial licensing reasons or other reasons, but they're focused on the Asia-Pacific region. And we'll look at the US and Europe perhaps later in the development program. Then have the manufacturing quality requirements at the different stages of development, starting off with phase 1 GMP and then moving through to process validation for marketing authorization. Non-clinical studies don't end when you start your clinical studies, and so you need to consider the timing and strategy for non-clinical studies that you may need to conduct during your development program. Talked a little bit before about your clinical trial strategy, phase 1, 2, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, whether you need to consider other populations, or whether you can also have a compressed clinical development strategy. Commercial importance is to include timelines and costs, at least estimates, into your planning requirements, so that you can either know how much money to raise or how long it's going to take. And then finally, we like to include key decision points in the development plan. So you may have heard of the saying, fail early and fail fast. So you need to have decision points where you decide whether or not it's worthwhile to continue the development of that program. So now I'm going to talk about 3 case studies to try and illustrate the power and why everyone should have a drug development plan in some form or format. I'm going to just note here that these cases are from real situations, but have been adapted to protect the confidentiality of our sponsor companies. The first one I'm going to talk about is an RSV vaccine in preclinical development. The second one is an immunomodulatory biological, which has completed its phase 1 first-in-human clinical trial and is heading into phase 2 development for the treatment of atopic dermatitis. And the final case study that I'm going to talk about today is a kinase inhibitor for the treatment of a rare leukemia. So the first case study is with an RSV vaccine. So it was a proprietary protein-based vaccine platform, designed to generate broad-based antiviral immunity, both cellular and humoral immunity. The stage of development for this particular program was they had promising proof of concept animal studies, so they could demonstrate that their platform, and with RSV in particular, produced robust immune response. But they had yet to enter yet to start their initial first-in-human clinical trial. So in the case of this RSV vaccine, the DDP or the CDP included a summary of the platform technology and the results from the exciting proof of concept animal studies. There were no predicate or competitor products, so there are no approved RSV vaccines, and there's a clear medical need. That could be expanded in later iterations of the development plan to cover some of the designs of products that are in development, but this early stage wasn't considered necessary. At this early stage, the company was using a generic, what I'd call a generic global strategy, and there was no specific milestones identified. So what that means that prior to phase 1, it wasn't worthwhile for this company to focus on a particular regulatory jurisdiction. Their target, and I should mention that development plans can be targeted for a particular milestone. Their targeted milestone was a phase 1 clinical trial conducted in Australia under the CTN scheme. They chose Australia because of it has a rapid regulatory system, and they thought it was an attractive country to conduct the phase 1 study. The focus at this stage of development was on the non-clinical requirements. So they, in putting together this plan, we put together a suggested GLP repeat dose toxicology study in rats, and we didn't identify any other significant toxicology studies that would be required. We suggested what is a robust phase 1 study design for vaccines, which consists of single doses followed by multiple ascending doses in healthy volunteers. The timeline and cost for this program, which is important, so in this case an early phase study, an early phase program, were there, so around 300,000 Australian dollars for the toxicology, and then about $1 million Australian dollars and a year in development for their first in-human clinical trial. And what these timelines and costs allow them to do is to allow the sponsor company to plan their fundraising, and go to the market with a specific development plan for their vaccine. Of course, for most products in development, a key decision point that was identified for this product was unacceptable toxicity in the GLP rat toxicology study. The next case study that I would like to talk about was a biological and interleukin antagonist for the treatment of atopic dermatitis. This company was a Korean company, had very promising proof of concept animal studies, a toxicology package to support 3-month dosing. And when we prepared the development plan, they had almost completed their phase 1 study, which was a single ascending dose, multiple ascending dose in healthy volunteers. So they were almost completed their phase 1 study and looking to plan their phase 2 study and their subsequent phase 3 development program. So what did this development plan look like for this atopic dermatitis treatment? So again, we started off with summarising the scientific rationale for the product. In this case, it was the molecular basis for the development of this particular biological. In this field, in the field of treating atopic dermatitis, there are actually a lot of competitive products that we looked at. These both set the standard for safety and efficacy that is going to be required for the product, set the expectations for the development of this product, and also provide relevant examples on the kind and scope of clinical trials that we require. An assessment of the regulatory strategy identified that breakthrough therapy designation would likely be possible if the phase 2 results are promising, but other regulatory opportunities such as orphan drug designation or other programs intended to expedite drug development are unlikely to be applicable for this particular product. We developed a clinical strategy that consisted of the phase 1. Well, we didn't develop that. That was already mostly completed. But then based on the research and analysis, it indicated that a phase 2 double-blind, complete placebo-controlled dose escalation study in about 120 participants would be a reasonable approach. Just to comment on the size of that trial, in this case it was based on comparator trials of similar products because there was no good understanding of the potential efficacy in humans on which we could base any useful power calculations. So that was for phase 2, based on again based on predicate products and competitor products. For phase 3, it was most likely that 2, not 1 but 2, pivotal phase 3 placebo-controlled studies with at least 1,000 patients, or more likely 2,000 patients, would be required to support the marketing authorization. We identified that atopic dermatitis affects children, but the pediatric strategy would need to be confirmed based on the phase 2 results, based on that safety and efficacy data that was generated from the phase 2 study. In these kinds, at this stage of development, it can be difficult to forecast timelines and costs all the way up through to phase 3, but we were able to provide a cost estimate of about $3 million for phase 2, which was very useful for fundraising, and then a ballpark for the phase 3, but noting that the phase 3s, the size of them will depend on the likely effect size. So we can make our best estimate, but it's not possible to forecast with a great degree of certainty at that stage of development. The key decision points for this program were, again, unacceptable toxicity in the healthy volunteer, or lack of efficacy or unacceptable safety in the phase 2 study. So the final case study I'd like to talk about today is a small molecule kinase inhibitor for the treatment of a rare leukemia. This stage, in this case, the company was really looking forward to solidify their pivotal phase 3 or phase 2/3 program and design that pivotal clinical trial package to support marketing authorization. The toxicology package was completed. The phase 1 study had completed in a range of malignancies and had identified a potential use for the agent in this rare leukemia. They've also done their healthy volunteer food effect study and moved on to a phase 2 study, a relatively small study but appropriate for this rare orphan indication, 58-patient study, where they found a frankly exciting result of a 47% objective response rate and a better safety profile compared to other kinase inhibitors. So what did the development plan look like for this product? So again, starting off with a molecular basis for development, a review of predicate and competitor products. This particular company had already obtained orphan drug designation and fast track designation, so they'd already thought about a lot of these things. And accelerated approval was a possibility. The next step in their development plan was to seek FDA and regulatory advice on the proposed pivotal study program, pivotal study design for their compound. So their development strategy, their clinical development strategy for this, which was appropriate for this product, was an open-label, multi-center, single-arm, phase 2/3 pivotal study with approximately 120 patients. In common with other oncology compounds or treatments, it was within cycles until disease progression or unacceptable toxicity up to a period of maximum period of 24 months, with a primary endpoint of ORR, as is appropriate for this particular rare leukemia. The cost and timeline for this program was $5 to $9 million and 3 to 5 years. So they had a clear idea of what they needed to support the marketing authorization of their compound. Key decision points in this particular case were, so they've designed their pivotal study, but would that be accepted by the regulators? Another decision point is potential lack of efficacy. It's very promising in the phase 2, but will that be seen in the pivotal program, and also a potential unacceptable safety profile? So to mitigate these key risks, the first one is that the regulators will not accept the proposed pivotal study. What we helped them to do is to meet with a regulator and discuss the strategy, and that was accepted by the regulator. So it's a mechanism of obtaining feedback and reducing the risk to the program. Another way of reducing the risk, which came from the development plan, was a potential lack of efficacy. And so a futility analysis was introduced to the clinical protocol. So if it does not look like it's going to have an effect, then you can then save time and money by cancelling that program sooner rather than later. But that was a very promising program, which is an ongoing clinical study. So that's a little bit about how we would support companies through their clinical development, and it's a couple of case studies on different strategies for different phases of development. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Robert Shepherd to talk about his experience and the experience of Dimerix.
Thanks for the introduction, Hiram. Very much appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about Dimerix and the program that we brought to the Biodex Desk team in 2019. So just as a little background to the company, Dimerix is an ASX-listed company in Australia. The company was founded in 2012 and was put on the Australian Stock Exchange in 2016. And we very much embody the concept of being a small virtual biotech company where we have a core internal team with a large amount of experience, but when we need external help to leverage any specific expertise, that's where we need to form good relationships with our vendors to help our little team internally. So in 2019, we need an external source of non-clinical and toxicology expertise to augment some of the questions our team were asking internally. So we chose the BioDesk team after an extensive search for a high-quality vendor that could help us address some of these non-clinical questions with a key focus on how they would be interpreted and work with the regulators. The BioDesk team have since then become an integral resource for us to really accelerate our regulatory and commercial goals by providing this on-demand expertise to really leverage our small team. So as Tracy mentioned way back in slide 14, it's really important to make sure that the non-clinical package you present to a regulator is tailored to a specific product. And this has been key to us because we've been using an existing drug that was originally registered in Japan in the 90s. And since then, we have taken that drug and looked to use it at a different dose, in a different formulation, and in very different indications. So we've taken this existing drug and used it in our renal program, and we approached the BioDesk team looking for a gap analysis to identify which evidence is in the literature and which evidence has been previously provided to regulators that we could use for future filings for our first-in-man, but also towards our NDA project. So this gap analysis that was performed by the BioDesk team provided us a very clear outline of studies that were still required and provided the evidence to support existing studies being used in the literature. This also included a full report of the genotoxicity data that was available, and this was from this molecule that we're using has an extensive history of use, and so this took quite a bit of work to bring all of these sources together to provide a strong report that we then provided to the FDA. So by bringing all of these data together in one place, we were able to take this non-clinical package of existing data and proposed future studies to the FDA, and had a very successful pre-IND meeting in 2019, where the FDA agreed with the studies that still needed to be done, which were only a few, and were very supportive of all of the work that had gone into building a data package that was appropriate for sourcing information from the literature. Since then, we have gone and gone back to the BioDesk team for a few follow-on questions and have developed this ongoing relationship, particularly looking at some of the questions of subsequent analysis of juvenile toxicology, what was available in the literature and what work we might need to do. And this information has been critical in informing our clinical development plan as to how we involve pediatric patients in our clinical plan, all driven back by what toxicological evidence has been available. So together, this building of knowledge and working with the team repeatedly has been great, because it's meant that we have been able to take and build data with the team over time and then keep referring back to that source of information as we've had further regulatory interactions.
Thank you very much. It's now time for our Q&A session. You can submit your questions via the Q&A widget. Just type them into the box on the right-hand side and click submit. But it looks like we have some questions coming in already. So our first question for today is, has COVID-19 impacted your ability for clients to achieve their milestones?
Thanks, Stefan. That's a great question. So I talked about clinical development plans, and you try and identify some potential risks and uncertainties, but COVID-19 was, I think, something that no one predicted or planned. But yeah, in terms of impact, it goes back to planning and risk mitigation. And when something unexpected does pop up, you need to reevaluate and try and find a better option. In the case of the companies we work with, we're lucky enough to work in the Asia Pacific region, which has not been affected by COVID-19 to the same extent as perhaps Europe and the US. So, yeah, as a fallback response to COVID-19 for clinical development, we found a number of sponsor companies are coming to Australia, coming to Asia to avoid impacts, COVID-19 impacts to their program.
Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question for today is, what are the key considerations for US versus EU market entry?
So I'll take this one again. It's another good question. Thank you. So some aspects of EU-US market entry are going to be the same, and there's others, they have slight variations. Ideally, you would want to have a package that will satisfy both regions. Broadly speaking, there's a perception that for the US, they prefer or will accept placebo-controlled trials, an example of the differences, where in Europe they prefer active controlled clinical trials. So it's important when you're planning, particularly your later stage clinical trials, to consider potential differences in both regulator preferences and also in potentially the standard of care in your particular indication, and with the aim of developing a program that will satisfy both regions, if both regions is a commercial goal of the company. Some companies are quite happy just to focus on one or the other. But it's a good question.
Thank you very much for that.
Could I just add something from a preclinical perspective? We often get asked if there's differences between the two, US, Europe, or whether Australia accept anything that would be slightly different to the other regulators. And I'd say generally that the Australian expectation is they follow EU guidance, just to say that the EU guidance has been adopted by the TGA and that the HREC are perfectly aware of the EU guidance and ICH, and so there's quite often not a great deal of difference between the expectations of the different regions. Although I think it'd be fair to say that the Australian approach is perhaps fairly pragmatic and science-driven. So if there was a very good reason for something to perhaps not be there, or maybe in one species rather than two, and there's clear justification for that, that the scientific rationale supporting any variations should be clearly presented. But otherwise, they're fairly similar, at least in the early phases. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much for that answer. Just a quick reminder to the audience, you can still ask your questions via the Q&A widget. Just type them into the box and click submit. But on to our next question. What methods or regulatory processes are available for expediting approval?
There's a range of methods that companies should be aware of, a range of processes that the regulators offer in order to speed up drug approvals and drug development. To comment on a couple of them I've touched on, so there's orphan drug designation if you're developing an indication, developing a product to treat a rare indication. And then for truly exciting products that are impacting life-threatening diseases, there's a range of programs. Particularly if your target market is the US, a range of programs such as breakthrough designation that can get you more support from the regulator and increase, speed up your drug development timelines.
Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question for today is, what are the most common or biggest hurdles in the regulatory process?
Maybe I could comment on that. Sorry, Hiram. I was just thinking in terms of toxicology aspects there initially. The biggest hurdles can sometimes be, maybe not, or having a clear risk that maybe not being examined appropriately in terms of whether that's being clinically monitored for, or whether there's a clear safety margin calculation, and it's quite important to have a clear no effect level and safety margin calculations to make sure that you can appropriately and safely, titrate into your initial clinical trial at least. Maybe Hiram has other experiences in terms of other more regulatory focused processes.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tracy. In terms of the biggest regulatory obstacles, to go back to what we talked about earlier in the webinar, it's not having a plan or not having a sufficiently developed plan to push the development of your treatment forward. It's fine to have an aggressive regulatory approach and then validate that by obtaining feedback from the regulators. And Robert can perhaps comment on this, obtaining feedback from the FDA for the Dimerix experience. But yeah, the biggest obstacle is not having, I would say, would be not having a plan or not having a realistic plan to start with. Robert, did you have any comments from your experience with Dimerix and going to the FDA?
I think the gold standard here is go to the regulator early and frequently as you possibly can. I think a lot of sponsors have traditionally shied away from the regulator wanting to have sufficient data to go to them. But the regulators in recent times, particularly if you are operating with something like an orphan drug designation, which we are, we have orphan drug designations both with the FDA and EMA for our indication for focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. This has allowed us a relatively open dialogue with the regulator to ask questions there that could be years of making data to support a problem that you perceive the regulator might have that could be addressed much earlier and quicker and cleaner than having to go and either do too much work or risk getting to your next regulatory interaction and not have sufficient data.
Thank you, everyone, for that answer. Our next question for today is, what are the biggest challenges for small companies starting in the area, and what functions should be critical to establish early? Robert, maybe you can take this on as well.
It's the story of my life, so very happy to talk about this one. The critical part for a small company is getting the right team and right expertise in the room to be able to understand the hugely complex task of tying together all of the aspects of drug development, right from the principal pharmacology through to the manufacturing of how you're going to manufacture your drugs, through to the non-clinical studies you'll need to do right across the gambit of all of the studies that need to be done prior to getting up to your first in man, but also making sure that everything that a small company is doing, because it's generally done with very limited resources, that every activity that is done is pushing the needle a little bit further and further and further towards your next regulatory interaction, and making sure that there's no wasted capital in having to repeat studies or having to do the wrong studies and do them again. So it's really clear that having the right team and right reviews, particularly different gap analyses, is essential to make sure that you're doing the right thing at the right time. Hiram, anything to add to that?
No, don't have anything to add. That was a great answer.
Thank you very much. Just a quick reminder to the audience, you can still ask your questions via the Q&A widget, but moving on to our next question. What is the regulatory milestones for rare diseases?
I mean, the regulatory milestones, in my view, are going to be similar, but to a treatment for a common disease, except some aspects of the development program may look a little different. So I think I touched on that in my case studies. So for a treatment for atopic dermatitis, as an example, the phase 3, or the milestone for the clinical development is a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial with 1 to 2,000 people. So that's a bit different from the oncology compound, where you have an open-label study in maybe 100 or 150 patients. So the design of those trials is different, but I think that the milestone in that you obtaining sufficient clinical data to support marketing authorization is similar.
Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question for today is, how would you simplify product development?
I think from my perspective, I think as we've talked about, what's key here to avoid unnecessary work or perhaps missing strategic pieces of work is to have a very clear strategy, have a very clear target product profile of where the program wants to go. What does the label in the future, what do you want it to look like, what's that desirable set of characteristics, and how are you going to create that plan and strategy to be able to achieve that desirable label. And if you can work out the strategy and the most effective way to get that, and have regular regulatory interactions along the way, as Robert mentioned earlier, perhaps rather than just leaving it till later on at phase 2, for example, which might be a bit too late, should, in theory, give you a very streamlined and cost-effective process.
Thank you very much for that answer. I think we have time for one more question, which is, what is the process for starting a clinical trial?
Maybe I could talk about that one for maybe in Australia, which might be a little bit, people often ask the question, what do they need for an Australian submission, which might vary a little bit from people's experience with an IND submission, for example. In Australia, the key documents for this process is a summary of all the information, whether it's CMC, preclinical toxicology, and any clinical, if that's available, needs to be summarised in the investigator brochure, and that, along with the clinical study protocol, are the 2 key documents that are submitted to HREC for submission and review of that package and approval of that clinical trial. That differs from an IND, which would have a much more comprehensive, particularly CMC summary detailed in that IND, which is not to the same level of information that would be required for an Australian submission. I don't know if there's anything else on that process, Hiram, you wanted to comment on.
I could be here all day talking about what you need to get into a clinical trial, but that might be all we have time for today.
Yeah, thank you very much for that answer. As Hiram mentioned, that is all the time we have for questions for today. Keep in mind, if you didn't get your question answered today, they can be answered at a later date offline. So that just leaves me to thank Robert, Tracy, and Hiram for what was a great presentation, and to Novotech for sponsoring this session. To the attendees, you'll receive an email shortly telling you how to access the on-demand version of this webinar. We can do this through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. Thank you once again. I hope you have a great day.